This is what avoidants feel at 2 a.m. after losing the super empath. It's 2 a.m. The world is quiet, but their mind is loud. The avoidant is lying in bed, scrolling through an old photo album, rereading texts they never replied to, hovering over your contact, but never pressing send. They once told themselves, I just need space. But now, all they feel is emptiness. They lost you. The one who understood them without needing words. The one who offered love without pressure. The one who saw through the armor and chose to love the soul beneath it. You weren't just kind, you were wise. You saw the way they flinched at closeness. You gave patience. You gave grace. You gave everything until giving became exhaustion. And when you finally walked away, they mistook your silence for peace. They didn't know it was self-respect. At 2 a.m., the avoidant doesn't miss the version of you who chased. They miss the one who stopped. They miss the calm of being understood, the safety of your emotional intelligence. They realize, too late, that the super empath isn't someone you replace. You either rise to meet their depth or you lose them. So what do avoidants feel at 2 a.m.? Regret. Not for what they did, but for what they were too afraid to do. To open up, to say, I love you when it counted. To choose healing over hiding. And by the time they realize they lost real love, the kind people spend lifetimes searching for, you're already gone. Not out of bitterness, but because even empaths have limits. And yours was the moment you realized you don't have to shrink to be loved. At 2 a.m., when the distractions are gone and the world is still, the avoidant finally feels what they've been running from. All day, they've been able to keep their mind occupied, work, social media, surface-level conversations. But now, in the silence of the night, regret creeps in like an unwelcome guest. And it's not just a passing thought, it's a full body ache. They think about the one person who saw past the far aid. The person who didn't try to change them, but rather gently held space for their complicated emotions. The super empath, that rare kind of individual who doesn't just listen, they hear, they feel, and they understand on a level most people never reach. Avoidants often pride themselves on being independent, on needing no one. But that independence is usually a defense. A survival tactic learned after years of associating closeness with danger. When someone finally breaks through those defenses, it's disarming, it's confusing, it feels too good to be true, so they push it away. They convince themselves the closeness is suffocating. The emotional transparency is too intense. The love is too available. They crave freedom, but what they're really running from is the vulnerability that freedom requires. And the super empath, they understand this dance. At first, they step back when asked. They give space. They regulate themselves so they don't overwhelm. They choose softness when most would react with force. But over time, that kind of emotional generosity, constantly attuning to someone who's terrified of being seen, becomes exhausting. Still, they hold on longer than most because they believe in the potential they see behind the avoidance walls. They're not naive, they're just hopeful. And when they finally leave, it's not impulsive. It's the final decision of someone who waited longer than they should have, someone who gave everything and realized it was never going to be enough for someone who didn't want to be met halfway. At 2 a.m., that realization hits the avoidant like a cold wave. They don't miss the drama. They don't miss the conversations they avoided. They miss the feeling of being seen, of being accepted in their most raw form. They remember the texts they left on read, the calls they avoided, the invitations they declined. At the time, they thought they were preserving themselves. But now, they see they were just protecting a fear that cost them someone irreplaceable. There's a weight that comes with knowing someone loved you so deeply and you couldn't receive it. And that weight doesn't disappear. It lingers in the quiet moments, in old songs, in familiar scents, in dreams where they almost say what they never had the courage to say out loud. It's not just regret for the relationship lost. It's regret for the version of themselves they never allowed to emerge, the one that could have met that love with equal depth. The super empath is the kind of person who loves in a way that feels like home. They don't need grand declarations or constant reassurances because their presence alone is steady, calm, and unwavering. They sense what others feel even before it's spoken, and they hold space in a way that makes emotional chaos feel safe. When they love someone, especially an avoidant, they do so with an open heart and an extraordinary amount of patience. They understand that not everyone expresses love the same way, and they don't punish people for their wounds. In fact, they try to understand those wounds and meet them with compassion rather than judgment. When the avoidant starts pulling away, the empath doesn't chase immediately. They pause, they observe, they ask questions that are gentle, not invasive. They offer connection, but never force it. They do this not because they lack boundaries, but because they recognize the fear behind avoidance, the fear of being vulnerable, of being hurt, of being consumed by someone else's expectations. The super empath meets that fear with softness, believing that with time and consistency, trust will grow. They adapt, they self-regulate, they hold back their own needs just enough to make space for the other person's healing process. But there is a hidden cost to this kind of emotional labor. As the empath continues to give, understanding silences, decoding mixed signals, managing their own feelings while making room for the avoidance discomfort, they start to chip away at themselves. They begin to question whether their needs are too much, whether their desire for emotional intimacy is somehow a burden. They silence parts of themselves to keep the peace, hoping that eventually the avoidant will feel safe enough to meet them in the middle. But that moment rarely comes. Empaths are strong, but they are not infinite. There comes a point where the emotional scale becomes too unbalanced to ignore. They begin to feel alone in the relationship, even when they're not physically alone. They feel emotionally starved, pouring love into someone who isn't ready to receive it, let alone reciprocate it. That emptiness starts to outweigh the connection they once held so dearly. And that's when the shift happens. The empath stops over-functioning. They stop reaching out. They stop making excuses for behavior that never changes. Walking away is not an act of anger for them. It's a painful reclaiming of self. It's a decision that comes only after they've tried everything. They don't leave hoping the avoidant will chase them. They leave because they finally understand that love should not feel like a constant emotional negotiation. Even the most intuitive, loving person has a threshold, and once it's crossed, they don't burn bridges. They simply walk away with quiet finality. The empath's strength lies not just in how much they can give, but in knowing when to stop giving to someone who doesn't know how to receive. Avoidants often carry a deep, hidden contradiction within them. On the surface, they appear calm, composed, even detached. They may say they value independence above all, that they prefer space, that emotional intensity feels overwhelming. But underneath that well-constructed armor lies a truth they rarely admit. Even to themselves, they crave connection just as deeply as anyone else. The problem isn't closeness, it's vulnerability. Being truly seen terrifies them, not because they don't want to be loved, but because they're afraid of what love might expose. To open up emotionally is to risk being hurt. For an avoidant, that risk feels unbearable. Somewhere in their past, whether through neglect, inconsistency, or emotional chaos, they learned that closeness can turn into pain, so they built walls. They convinced themselves that needing someone is weakness, that emotions are distractions, that being self-contained is safer than being open. But safety and fulfillment don't always live in the same space. And over time, that strategy isolates them from the very experiences that could heal them. When they meet someone like a super empath, someone who offers emotional safety, who listens without judgment, who leans in instead of pulling away, the avoidant is drawn in but also destabilized. The empath's openness shines a light on everything the avoidant keeps in the dark. Suddenly, they're faced with someone who doesn't play games, who communicates clearly, who asks for depth without demanding perfection. And this triggers something deep, a longing to be known and loved, alongside a fear that once they are truly seen, they will be rejected. Instead of leaning into the opportunity for intimacy, the avoidant often chooses control. They pull back when conversations get too real. They minimize feelings. They turn moments of closeness into reasons to retreat. This isn't because they don't care. It's because caring means being exposed, and exposure means vulnerability. Vulnerability to them feels like danger, no matter how safe the other person may be. This fear of vulnerability is what causes the most damage in their relationships. It's not the desire for space that ruins things. It's the refusal to let anyone in. It's the silence when reassurance is needed. It's the emotional shutdown when a partner reaches for connection. The avoidant may think they are preserving themselves, but what they're really doing is preventing the very thing they want: to feel emotionally bonded to someone who sees them, accepts them, and stays. They often don't realize this until it's too late, until the person who offered them unconditional love has finally had enough, until the silence they created becomes permanent. Only then do they begin to see that their fear didn't protect them, it sabotaged them. And the intimacy they thought they didn't need turns out to be the very thing they now can't stop missing. When the super empath finally walks away, it's not with fireworks or fury. It's not the dramatic exit the avoidant might have unconsciously expected. It's quiet, measured, and final. There's no shouting match, no list of demands, no emotional breakdown. It's the sound of boundaries being restored after being bent for far too long. It's the moment when the empath stops justifying behavior that never changes and realizes that staying would only continue to erode their sense of self. This silence can be misinterpreted. To the avoidant, it might look like peace. They may even assume the empath simply moved on easily, unaffected. But that couldn't be further from the truth. The empath's silence is hard-earned. It is the result of countless internal battles of trying to reconcile someone's inconsistent actions with their deep capacity for love. It is the final step after giving second chances, after holding space, after shrinking their own needs in hopes of preserving the connection. It is not bitterness. It is clarity. It is dignity. It is self-respect finally taking the lead where hope used to live. Avoidants often operate in a cycle of pulling away, then returning once the emotional dust settles. They come back when they assume the empath will still be there. Waiting, understanding, open. And for a while, that's true. The empath does wait, not because they lack strength, but because they have hope. Hope that the avoidant will choose growth over fear. Hope that love will eventually feel safer than distance. But each return without change chips away at that hope until there's nothing left but emotional fatigue. When the empath finally walks away, it's not a punishment, it's a protection of their energy, their heart, their sanity. They stop chasing, not because they stopped caring, but because they started caring about themselves just a little bit more. They no longer try to decode silence or rationalize avoidance. They stop absorbing emotional responsibility that was never theirs to carry. They walk away because staying would mean abandoning themselves. For the avoidant, the realization doesn't usually come immediately. At first, they may feel relief. The pressure's gone. No one's asking for connection anymore. But then time passes, and they notice the absence, not just of the person, but of the feeling that person brought. The calm in chaos, the acceptance despite flaws, the emotional intelligence that bridged every communication gap. And by then, it's too late, because when an empath truly walks away, they rarely come back, not out of pride, but because they already gave everything they had. And once they realize their value was never recognized, they give the last thing they have left: distance. To the avoidant, this distance feels sudden. But to the empath, it was the slowest goodbye they've ever said. There's a moment, often delayed, often unexpected, when the avoidant finally begins to feel the full weight of what they let slip away. In the beginning, they tell themselves the distance was necessary, that the space was a form of self-preservation. They rationalize that their walls kept them safe. But over time, especially in the stillness of solitude, those walls begin to resemble a prison more than a shield, and the absence of the super empath becomes something they can't ignore. Not just because the person is gone, but because the emotional security that person provided is now glaringly missing. The avoidant starts to recall all the little things they once took for granted: the non-judgmental presence, the emotionally intelligent conversations, the calm in the middle of conflict. They remember being seen not for who they pretended to be, but for who they actually were beneath the armor. The super empath didn't demand vulnerability, but created a space where it was safe to show up fully, honestly, imperfectly. The avoidant didn't know what to do with that kind of safety. They mistook it for pressure. They labeled it as too much. But in reality, it was everything they'd been silently craving. The problem is, when you're used to emotional survival, true connection feels foreign. Vulnerability doesn't register as intimacy, it registers as danger. So they retreat. They withdraw to the familiar comfort of emotional distance. But love cannot exist at arm's length. You can't build intimacy without risk, without openness, without the willingness to be uncomfortable sometimes. And when the avoidant chooses self-protection over connection, they sever the very lifeline that was guiding them toward healing. By the time they realize this, the empath is gone. The texts are no longer being sent. The energy that once waited for them, held space for them, extended grace to them, has been redirected. The avoidant finally understands that love is not something that waits forever. that someone can love you deeply and still leave when they're consistently met with fear instead of reciprocity. This is where the regret becomes sharp, because they see it now. The empathy they dismissed as too emotional was actually emotional maturity. The openness they feared was actually a gift, a rare invitation to be known and accepted. The love they kept at a distance was the exact thing they needed in order to feel whole. And now that it's gone, they start to grasp the reality that emotional safety doesn't just exist everywhere. It's something special, something sacred, something earned. Avoidants don't usually miss the chaos. They miss the stability, the quiet reassurance of someone who wasn't trying to change them, but simply wanted to meet them. And they come to realize, often when it's far too late, that love doesn't disappear with a door slam or a loud goodbye. Sometimes it disappears silently after being slowly starved of reciprocity, and once it's gone, they are left sitting in the ruins of their own defenses, finally ready to give everything, but with no one left to receive it. And so, what avoidants feel at 2 a.m. after losing the super empath is not just loneliness, it's the ache of knowing they were loved in a way most people only dream of, and they pushed it away out of fear. They don't miss being pursued. They miss being understood. They don't miss the warmth because it's gone. They miss it because they know they turned away from it when it was right in front of them. By the time they recognize what they had, the empath has already healed. They've already reclaimed their power. They've already remembered who they are without having to overextend to feel worthy. The tragedy is not that the avoidant was unloved. It's that they were deeply loved and couldn't let it in. But there's a lesson in this for all of us. That love isn't about who holds on the longest. It's about who chooses to show up fully honestly and consistently. Emotional safety isn't created by one person pouring endlessly. It's created when both people meet each other with courage. So if you're the empath who had to walk away, know this: it wasn't weakness. It was wisdom. You didn't give up, you grew up. And if you're the avoidant now sitting in the silence, ask yourself not just who you lost, but who you're willing to become next time love knocks again. Because love doesn't wait forever. And sometimes the person who loved you best won't be there when you're finally ready. Thank you for listening. Take care of your heart. And remember, the right person will never ask you to become smaller just to be loved. Good night and thank you.